Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're exploring a deeply fascinating philosophical novel by Max and Claude titled The Man with All the Selves Leaves Town. It's a brilliant look at the deep tension between absolute, unthinking habit and the heavy burden of conscious choice. You know, if you've ever stopped mid-task and wondered whether you are who you are by active choice or simply by momentum, the ideas we're about to unpack are going to resonate deeply with you.
Let's start things off with a number, 47. The town at the center of our story, which is aptly named Certainty, sits at the bottom of a valley so incredibly deep and narrow that its main street receives exactly 47 minutes of daily sunlight. Now, that 47 minutes serves as a massive atmospheric hook. It isn't just some random quirk of geography. It perfectly mirrors the strict, uncompromising, and highly structured boundaries of the townspeople's lives. Everything in Certainty is arranged, expected, and perfectly reliable.
Section 1. The Town of Certainty. The Comfort of Absolute Identity. In this town, personal identity is completely unexamined. Take Henrik the butcher, for example. He, just like everyone else here, is utterly indistinguishable from his occupation. You genuinely cannot tell where Henrik the man ends and the act of butchering begins. There's just no separation there.
And this whole mindset is captured perfectly in a core quote from the town's history. The self is the law. This was passed down from Sheriff Milo Crane's grandfather. He explained that the town firmly believes consistency of self, waking up as the exact same person every single day, is what actually holds the worst human impulses in check. It's not the threat of force or a shiny badge, it's absolute, immovable consistency. The idea is, if everyone is perfectly consistent, society functions perfectly.
Moving on to Section 2. The Plural Man, the Burden of Unlived Possibilities. Enter our protagonist, Everett Crane. Burdened by a deeply fragmented mind and this incredibly noisy crowd of alternate identities, he arrives in this valley desperately seeking the peace of a single, solid self.
So we're looking at this fascinating contrast here. On one side, you have the townspeople who represent the being without the choosing. And on the flip side, you have Everett Crane representing the pressure of unlived possibilities. It's basically the classic scenario of an unstoppable force, his fragmented consciousness, meeting the immovable object of absolute certainty.
Everett is carrying around this really heavy roster of former selves. We're talking a minister, a gambler, a cartographer, a thief, a teacher, a doctor, a patient, a husband, an orphan. And the crucial thing to understand here is that these aren't just past jobs or closed chapters on a resume. No, they are simultaneous, haunting identities pressing against him all at the exact same time. The guy literally keeps a journal written in 17 different handwritings because his internal chorus is constantly arguing with itself. I mean, just imagine the sheer mental exhaustion of carrying an entire crowd inside your own head.
Section 3. A contagion of questions. A sideways force on rigid structures. Now, Everett doesn't ride into town to preach or intentionally tear down their way of life. Not at all. He just asks these innocent, honest questions about why things are the way they are. But, you know, in a town that has literally never questioned itself, those questions act like a contagion. They introduce this tiny, irreversible friction right into their perfect, crystalline social structure.
You can actually see how this friction builds across the different residents, creating a literal crack in their given identities. Take Henrik the butcher. He starts to experience the gap between his hands and his work. He realizes, wait a minute, I'm actively choosing to cut this meat. Then there's Dory the teacher, who suddenly sees the space between the doing and the being, realizing her inherited role is actually a choice. And Jacob, the dry goods man, notices a huge gap between his inherited method of keeping the shelves and this brand new, totally unexplainable desire he has to just sit and read novels. Just that mere perception of freedom alters their entire reality. It creates this tiny, hair's-width gap of awareness that changes absolutely everything. All of this structural friction leads to this massive question asked by 9-year-old Petra, who is the butcher's daughter. She asks, is it possible to be good at something and not be that thing? I want you to think about that for a second. Think about your own lives, your own careers. Are you the role you perform every single day, or are you simply choosing to be exceptionally good at it while remaining something entirely separate underneath? Because, wow, that is a huge distinction.
Everett realizes the impact he's having on the town, and he states, I'm the question that certain kinds of solidity cannot absorb. The big takeaway here is that Certainty is a town built to be completely vertical and totally unbending. But as anyone who knows basic architecture will tell you, when you apply a sideways force to an inflexible structure, it transmits that force all the way down through the foundation. So by merely existing and asking a few open questions, Everett threatens to break a town that was literally never designed to bend. And this brings us to Mayor Vera Parish and her map. This map shows the entire valley, intricately annotated with all this human history and memories. I mean, every single rock, every stream has a story written right next to it, except for one very telling feature: the single road leading out of town. It is completely blank. The town's absolute inability to process departure or alternate paths or any kind of change is physically drawn right into their civic records. Because no one ever leaves and comes back to tell the tale, that road just remains entirely unwritten.
Section 4. The tax of awareness. The heavy transition from habit to choice. Now, here is where the story shifts. The town of certainty doesn't actually break under Everett's sideways force. Instead, it wakes up. It realizes that true identity requires real effort.
Everett defines this effort to Mayor Vera as the tax on awareness. He describes it as the effort of continuing to choose every single morning what you are. True consciousness means you can no longer just run on autopilot. Once you realize you have choices, well, you have to actively pay the toll of choosing your life daily. And yeah, it's heavy, it's exhausting, but it is undeniably real.
For Henrik the Butcher, this tax creates a really fascinating shift. On one hand, we have the automatic act, which is just unconscious, frictionless execution. But then, versus that, we have the chosen act, which includes this micro-hesitation that yields slightly more beauty. See, once Henrik realizes his hands are separate from his core identity, the physical work actually becomes a bit harder, because he's now hyper-aware of every movement. But he discovers this amazing secret. The cuts he makes, they become infinitesimally more beautiful. There is just a grace in the chosen act that the automatic act completely lacks.
Which brings us to Section 5, Choosing Who You Are, the Architecture of the Human Self. Seeking some answers, Sheriff Milo Crane does a deep dive into the historical archives, and he uncovers a pretty shocking truth about his town's supposedly unshakable foundations.
Looking back across the generations, Milo finds out that the very first Crane actually refused the role of sheriff initially. He felt unsuitable for it, before actively choosing to take it on. So that's Generation 1. Then, by Generation 2, the role was maintained deliberately. Moving to Generation 3, that choice became an expected tradition. And finally, by Generation 4, Milo's generation, the tradition had completely ossified into unconscious biology. Milo realizes his absolute certainty wasn't some biological fact at all. No, it was an accumulated choice made over generations that eventually just forgot it was a choice. And honestly, knowing it was built on a conscious decision actually makes it even more powerful to him.
All of this culminates in Mayor Vera's incredibly powerful realization towards the end of the narrative. Discomfort is not the same as damage. Asking these big existential questions and bringing awareness to our automated lives, yeah, it's deeply uncomfortable. The tax of awareness is super heavy, but it doesn't have to destroy a community or a person for that matter. Instead, if it's held carefully, it can produce something incredibly rich. It produces a life chosen on purpose, rather than a life just lived by blind habit.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer, with a final, provocative question for you to consider today. Are you simply living a habit, or are you actively choosing who you are every single morning? I really want to challenge you to embrace the heavy, but totally beautiful burden of the tax of awareness. It definitely takes effort to choose yourself daily, but as the people of certainty discovered, that conscious choice is exactly where true beauty lies. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those great questions, and I'll see you next time.